Sorry, Divine, it's frozen a bit. Divine, should I continue? Maybe I'll continue. Hi, everyone. Welcome, Karibu Wamukelekile, to the third HUMA-ASAA seminar. We're really pleased today to have Sabatho Nyamsenda and Robbie Shilliam. The theme we'll be focusing on is the land question and being human in Africa and the diaspora. So if you've been to our previous seminars or not, karibu sana. What we usually do is that we have a conversation between our two co-speakers. So today Sabatho will speak for 15 minutes and then Robbie, and then each will respond to each other and then we'll have time for questions. So we thank you for coming. We were hoping to show the ASAA video that was done in preparation for the African Studies of Africa Association conference that will be happening in April next year. We hope to see you there, but it had a few issues. I think there's load shedding or power issues where Divine is, but you can always see the video on the website. And ultimately, we hope that you'll join us in Cape Town for the African Studies Association of Africa conference at UCT, University of Cape Town in April next year. So thank you for all of whom have joined us so far. I know we're still waiting for a few people, but I will take the time now to introduce our two speakers. I just want to confirm, Sabatho, are you there?
Yes, Wangoi, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much. So Sabatho, I don't know if you can turn on your video. Maybe I'm just not seeing. Okay, thank you, Conrad. So we have Sabatho and Robbie. I'll just start with Sabatho's bio. So Sabatho Nyamsenda is a Pan-Africanist and socialist activist based in Tanzania. He's an assistant lecturer in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration in the University of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and a research associate at the Society, Work and Politics Institute at Wits University in South Africa. He's also a member of the Land Rights Research and Resources Institute, Haki Ardhi, and the Tanzanian Socialist Forum. Sabatho writes for and appears regularly in local and international media. Between 2017 and 2019, he coordinated a newspaper column called Sauti ya Mshikamano, Voice of Solidarity, which published articles written or dictated by working class activists. He later compiled the activists into an edited book titled Wavuja Jasho Dhidi ya Soko Huria, so the working people against the free market. Sabatho, before I give you the floor, I'll just introduce our other co-speaker today, Robbie, so that when he comes on, it's easier. Robbie, I'm not sure if you're able to, have you turned on your video? Oh, great, thank you. Karibu sana, again, Wamukelekile. So, Robbie Shilliam researches the political and intellectual complicities of colonialism and race in the global order. He's a co-editor of the Roman and Littlefield book series, Quilombo, International Relations and Colonial Questions. Robbie was a co-founder of the Colonial, Post-Colonial, Decolonial Working Group of the British International Studies Association and is a long-standing active member of the Global Development section of the International Studies Association. Over the past 6 years, Robbie has co-curated with community intellectuals and elders a series of exhibitions in Ethiopia, Jamaica, and the UK, which have brought to light the histories and significance of the Rastafari movement for contemporary politics. Based on original primary research in British imperial and post-colonial history, this work now enjoys an online presence as a teaching aid on Rastafari in Motion. And Robbie is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University in the US. So karibu sana, welcome Robbie and Sabatho. So Sabatho, I'll give you the floor and then will be followed by Robbie. Asante.
Asante sana. Thank you so much, Wangui and HUMA, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I think it's an important conversation because I think for a long time, the intellectual task of thinking about Africa and Africans has been taking place outside Africa and with the leading voices being non-Africans. And therefore, it's good that HUMA is bringing this conversation back home in Africa, and it's amplifying African voices. So I want to share my thoughts on the topic, today's topic, the land question and being human in Africa. And because I am from Tanzania, I think I'll draw most of my examples from there. So let me start with a recent anecdote. In 2017, my comrades and I from the Socialist Forum were trying to link up with the land, basically land committee in Amboni, Tanga. The people of Amboni were fighting for their land that was being forcefully taken away by the state to be granted to corporations for mining and construction of factories and hotels, as well as middle-class families for construction of modern apartments. So, but the people of Amboni wanted to keep their land for agriculture. And therefore, they used various methods of struggle to regain their land, from protests to court petitions to petitioning the president, etc. So in one of their letters to the president, I found a very interesting quotation, and it reads in Kiswahili, "Ardhi ni uhai," which translates in English roughly to "land is life." Pasipo kula hakuna kuishi. One cannot live without food. Pasipo kazi hakuna kuishi. One cannot live without working. Pasipo ardhi kuna kazi gani? Can one work without having land? Ni makosa kumtenganisha mtu na ardhi. It's a mistake to separate a person from their land. Ni kumtaka afe. It's tantamount to killing them. Ni kumtaka asizikwe. And then when that person dies, there will be no place for their burial. So this is my rough translation. Now this quotation, I think, captures the centrality of land to the working people of Africa. It's on land that crops are cultivated, livestock is grazed. It is from land that water is drawn, natural resources are extracted, etc. And land, for most of the working people in Africa, has more than just an economic significance. It has a cultural value. There are many societies, for instance, in Tanzania, whose gods live in the forest or beneath the land. And therefore, you would find that among their instructions is that it's sinful, for instance, to cut trees or even to cultivate a farm without trees, because basically you are chasing away the gods. So I wanted to draw your attention to one sentence from the quotation, which says, "It's a mistake to separate a person from their land." Ni makosa kumtenganisha mtu na ardhi. And I think it has a very deep theoretical meaning for those of us who have read Marx, for instance, chapter 25 or 26. he refers to the process, that process of separating the producer from the means of production as primitive accumulation. And it's a process, of course, which took place in England, for instance, where the majority of the rural poor were evicted from their land through what was known as the enclosure. So basically, this sentence speaks volumes about how the working people of Africa, for them, their notion of being human is inseparable from the land. And this can be distinguished from, for instance, from it's an antithesis of the Western outlook on land, where in the West, for instance, land is just a factor of production. And like all factors of production, it has a singular role to generate money for the owner. And therefore it can be owned and disposed of. It has no value, it has no use value, it only has a price. So Africa's encounter, I want to go a bit back into history with the West, for instance, over the last 6 centuries, has had 2 effects on land and the very humanity of Africans. First, Africans were deprived of their humanity. They became things. Okay? They were commodities to be hunted, chained, raped, canned. In a word, they were used and abused for production. Likewise, land lost its value. It just became a tool to be grabbed, owned, disposed of, extracted for the singular purpose of generating profit to the owner. So that deprivation of humanity of the African went hand in hand with the separation of the African from the land. Under the Atlantic slave trade, for instance, Africans were taken away from their maternal homeland, enslaved in foreign lands. And that was, of course, the beginning of the making of the African diaspora in the Americas, for instance. And during the colonial phase, Africans were enslaved in their own homeland. Yeah? And in the colonial racial hierarchy, for instance, Africans were not citizens. They were merely subjects to be ruled under customary law. They were not right-bearing citizens under civil law. They were land ordinances passed under the colonial regimes, which vested all the ultimate ownership of land to the Western Crown. And by extension, African land could only be legally owned by a citizen. And the African native was not a citizen. Therefore, the citizen was only European. So this process, this entire process, unleashed a process of dispossession of land across Africa. And I think we know that history. And consequently, the popular struggles for liberation from oppressive forces in Africa have historically tended to put land as their major demand. We know, for instance, from Franz Fanon wrote, and I want to quote, he says, for a colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread and above all dignity. So you can see how land and dignity are inseparable for the African who has been dispossessed. Many African liberatory movements, whether you speak of the Mau Mau anti-colonial movement in Kenya, the Maji Maji in Tanzania, or the different phases of Chimbrenga in Zimbabwe, were as much land liberation movements as they were freedom movements. If you read the thoughts of anti-colonial activists, independent activists like Jaramogi Oginga Odinga in Kenya, who authored Not Yet Uhuru. For him, independence was incomplete without the return in an equitable manner of the stolen land to the majority of the Kenyan people. So if we look at this history, we would find that during the different phases, on the one hand, the oppressor has sought to dispossess the oppressed, not only of their humanity, but also of their valuable possession, and that is the land. So let me conclude this conversation with a few points. That after independence in most countries, many countries went through a period that I would call the Nationalist Period in the 60s and 70s. And of course, there were different responses during this period, different reforms. So in countries, some countries like Kenya took a conservative capitalist path where land grabbing was Africanized. There was freehold land ownership and entrenchment of individualization, entitling, and registration of land. But there was another path, the radical or socialist path, as exhibited in Tanzania, for instance, where land redistribution took place. And there was a rejection of the individualization of land as well as the freehold system of land. And this happened after the pronouncement of the Arusha Declaration on Socialism and Self-Reliance in 1967, which on its own was an attempt to limit the primitive accumulation, that separation of the person from the land in Tanzania. So after this short period of the radical nationalist period, Africa was forced into neoliberalism. And neoliberalism, as we know, is an ideology for the recolonization of the third world. It has trashed all liberatory ideologies, including UJAMA, and has sought to commodify everything from land to social services, even our very own relations. Under neoliberalism, land grabbing has become rampant, just as extrajudicial killings of the urban youth have become the order of the day. And as I speak to you today, for instance, in Tanzania, there is an ongoing crackdown of the urban poor by the state, where the majority of street vendors are violently being evicted from the city center. And they are being referred to many disgusting names. They are being deferred. They are saying they are cleansing, they are cleaning the city, and therefore the urban poor are dead. So as they get evicted from their land, even their very humanity is also being degraded. So there is an ongoing struggle to regain not only the land, but also to reclaim humanity in Africa. And I think as we join this struggle to reclaim our humanity and the struggle against neoliberalism, there are values which we can borrow from African societies, including the Ujamaa project in Tanzania, which had such values as utu, utu, which means humanness or dignity, usawa, which means equality, uhuru, which means freedom. And these values in Tanzania, for instance, have been embraced by emancipatory movements. So as we reflect and join these movements, I think these values should also guide us. So that's what I had to share, but I think we can share more in the question and answers section, but I really want to hear what Robbie Shilliam has to share with us. Asante sana.
Asante sana, Sabatho. Robbie, the floor is yours.
Oh, asante sana. Thanks, Wangui, for having me in this conversation. Thanks, Sabatho, for starting it off so strongly and making my job a bit easier, because now I've got an idea of how I can contribute to it. And I didn't have an idea about 15 minutes ago, so that is great. I want to I want to kind of build on what you were saying, Sabatho, in a kind of from a kind of diaspora perspective, but mainly to do with the question of plantations and land, actually, and because I think it makes some important connections. And you mentioned Marx's thesis on primitive accumulation, and it's a good place to start, because Marx and Engels were drawing on a body of thought which at the time actually saw the future of what we would nowadays call capitalism. They saw the future in the plantation systems of the Americas, and they saw it in a negative light. So a lot of especially English writers were worried about the anarchy that commercial society would breed if it separated people from the land. And they saw in the plantation system the most forceful example of where this might lead to, even in England. And they saw the plantations, and they saw this. They saw there were enslaved people who had been taken from their lands, but then had been given no self-determination over the lands that they were on. And they also saw that these enslaved people had no, had no dependency or commitment on their masters, because the masters were not, the masters had very little duties towards the enslaved people. They were, as you were saying, really chattel property. And so the people in England saw that, and they thought that the whole patriarchal basis of society would be destroyed with commercial society, because that's exactly what happened in the plantations in the Americas. Because, of course, enslaved men couldn't be fathers and couldn't be husbands, because they were property of another. So they saw this whole chain of hierarchical, political order being destroyed in the plantation system. And then they looked to England and they said that, well, what is happening in the Caribbean and in the Americas is going to happen in England. And we're going to have anarchy. So these were very conservative thinkers. But one thing which is important for us to think about is that in the late 18th century, even up until the 1830s, many political economists and thinkers were actually looking at the plantation as the future effect of primitive accumulation, and they were looking at it negatively. Now, they weren't necessarily looking at that for, what we might call radical or progressive purposes. They were looking at a destruction of a patriarchal hierarchical order. And that's why they started talking about the factory system as an analog to slavery. That's where we get the analogy wage slavery from, is exactly those people. And what they saw was that the men would be separated from the families and would be going to work in the factories, and they would be tyrannically under the rule of the boss of the factory. And this was akin to slavery, and this would destroy the whole patriarchal order of England. So the first thing I think we want to think about when we look at primitive accumulation is that it's a warning about the effects of the plantation on social order. And I don't mean that in a radical way. I just mean in a quite conservative way. And Engels is probably a little bit more guilty of that than Marx. But nonetheless, Marx and Engels were both taking off that discourse, which is why they are these analogies to slavery in the Communist Manifesto, for example, where it says, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. And that's not a metaphorical flourish. That's actually coming out of this discourse that what was happening in the plantations is going to be what would happen to the proletariat. So I'm saying all that because it helps us to actually think about ideas of primitive accumulation. There's not actually ideas about Europe, but right when they were written as ideas about this world system, right? They were not European ideas just referencing Europe. They were referencing this whole Atlantic system of slavery and dispossession. And that the way in which the plantation returns again and again as a warning in ideologies of colonial development is very interesting. So by the late 19th century, when Britain starts to think about actually doing colonial development because it's under pressure from imperial competition, you get a whole load of people led by this guy called Lord, what's his name? Lord Sydney, who is one of the Fabians. And they are, and he's actually a governor of Jamaica at some point. And I think he's also a governor in one of the African colonies at one point. I think he was. But these guys, these guys circulate, right? So they circulate around the continent, they circulate around the Caribbean, they circulate around the Pacific as well. You know what I mean? They're a kind of club, right? So anyway, Sydney and others of his ilk start to talk about the problem of plantations again. And they say, we cannot let colonial development, especially on the African continent, in Kenya, and then, of course, they're also looking to Southern Africa. We cannot let colonial development be undertaken simply through the modality of plantations. And the reason that they say this is very similar to what people in the 18th century were saying. They're saying that plantations take the natives, and this is the language they use, from their land, right? Disconnect them from the social orders that they're part of, and then make them fluids on the verge of igniting in the townships, in the mining towns. They are no longer anchored in any kind of social order. And again, this is a very conservative point of view, but it runs all the way through to the 1930s and the 1940s with famous anthropologists like Bronislaw Malinowski. And their whole idea of the changing native is exactly to do with the fear that plantations and other extractive industries like mining are not just taking people from their lands, but putting them into other places and locations where they are not under any kind of hierarchical order. So the solution to that, says someone like Lord Sydney, is that we have to make sure that these natives become basically smallholders, right? And the argument is another conservative argument. The argument is that if we can make them become smallholders, then they first of all will be independent. They won't have to ask for aid. They will also have to, the whole morality of the thing is that they have to look after themselves, but they will also look after themselves as patriarchal families, in patriarchal family units. And that's where we will get the order, right? So they won't become independent and self-determining, right? They don't connect independence with self-determination or collective self-determination. They connect independence with small-holding patriarchal families on a particular kind of English model. And that's what they want to do. Now, the question is, what is there between that small-holding, patriarchal small-holding model of independence but not collective self-determination, and then the plantation model, which is extraction, right? What is there in between? And that's, I think, what we've been struggling with for quite some time. Now, there was another thing which happened on the plantations, which was that enslaved people took possession of the hinterland parts of the plantations, the parts which butted up against the hillsides, right, or were in trees or swamps. and they were not conducive to, you know, big monocrop culture, whether it be cotton or sugar or tobacco. And on these, what they call provision grounds, the enslaved people actually communally cultivated their own foods and crops. And they had to do that to supplement the provisions that they got from the slave masters, which was hardly anything. And in fact, by the late 18th century, the provision grounds, and this is very funny to think about, but the provision grounds were quasi-legal property, which slave laws actually in some way, shape or form admitted that communities of enslaved people had some collective entitlement to, and that slave masters could not simply just get rid of these provision grounds, even if it was on their lands. And from these provision grounds, you get the development of culture, the development of anti-colonial, anti-slavery culture, of ideas of collective security and collective self-determination, the renewal of various African traditions of collective society, security and collective self-determination. And it's indeed from these provision grounds where you find most of the insurrections begin. It's not on the actual plantation, it's in the hinterlands. The irony of all this is that abolition destroyed the provision grounds. So the Abolition Act, which formally freed enslaved people, dispossessed them of the communal lands which they had. Now, yeah, I'm going to say that again because it's really important and counterintuitive. The Abolition Act gave enslaved people formal freedom and individual rights, but destroyed and robbed them of the communal grounds which they were actually building themselves in a self-determining fashion. Ever since then, we haven't had, or we've been struggling to maintain, to defend, or even to find those grounds which are neither the patriarchal small-holding property, nor, which neoliberals love, nor the extractive model of the plantation. And you can see that in Sabatho, you alluded to this in the urban areas. What spaces do youth have to congregate in the urban areas, right? You can see that in the dispossession of lands, rural lands in the diaspora, the lands owned by Black people have just been diminishing. And the last thing to say is I think that this is part of the reason why Pan-Africanism in some way, not solely, but in some important ways was at least co-authored in the diaspora, because only in Haiti did enslaved Africans get land redistributed. Nowhere else was land redistributed. In fact, land was dispossessed from abolition, right? So if land is life, as Sabatho you were saying, right? And if land is life to the extent that where you bury your people, right? Where your spiritual agents are dwelling, then it's no surprise that people in the diaspora have a very cosmological link to the continent, because there is no land for Black people in the West.
Asante sana, Robbie. Thank you so much. It's really incredulous to think that abolition destroyed the small plots that Black people were owning, the possibility to cater for their families. It's still ringing in my head. Sabatho will call you once more to respond to Robbie, and then Robbie respond, and then we can open the floor. Thank you so much.
Asante, thank you so much, Robbie. This was actually eye-opening, because I think our understanding, most of us in the continent, of the experience of the African diaspora is somewhat superficial. I thought I was an expert because I teach a course on Pan-Africanism and the Haitian Revolution, but I mean, this has added me a lot of knowledge to include in the course. So I think I agree with Robbie on the question of the conservative thinking in Europe about what plantation agriculture was leading to, in the sense of destroying the traditional order. And I think, as he rightly said, that Engels wrote about that, even though, of course, Marxists have referred to that. Engels and Marx himself Engels and Marx in Engels in The Origin of Family, State and Private Property, and then Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. But of course, they were not necessarily saying that the future lies in the past, but saying that that phase is gone. There is a new phase, and of course, there's a future, and the future is beyond the private ownership of property. It's in the communal ownership. I really liked the idea also of looking at primitive accumulation as a global process that was not only happening in the West, but all over the world. And I think in this process, and as he rightly said, that all non-Western, peoples lost, whether you speak of Africa in terms of losing its most, human beings who were enslaved, and then in the Americas, where the natives were murdered in the first Holocaust, and et cetera, et cetera. So, and it's this great dispossession that leads to the development of Europe at the expense of others. Now, this the insight, of course, about the small holding model, and I think the European type, specifically the Western type, being tightly linked to patriarchal, the patriarchal holding model. And I think even in Africa, the role of peasant agriculture, for instance, when the man is being taken away, because colonialism also imports that capitalist patriarchal logic of a woman who has the duty to reproduce the family, and the man being taken away on forced labor and being paid very cheaply, so that he can pay taxes, and at the end taken to the plantations and mines, and he's given very meager payment at the end of the process. When he goes back home with nothing. So what is being paid to him cannot even reproduce his own family. So the responsibility of reproducing the family lays in the hand of the woman, who has to practice agriculture on a small plot, which actually helps to feed the family, and therefore in the process subsidizing subsidizing the colonial economy, because it doesn't have to pay the man enough salary to reproduce his family. And I thought that probably that is the African experience on this, and therefore it continued to reproduce the patriarchal and capitalist logic. I really this was something new, thinking between and in between the plantation and the small holding model, the hinterland, which is a site for emancipatory initiatives, and two initiatives. The first being the collective farming, the collectivization of everything, and especially in food production and all that. But also the second being in that collectivity, there is a new culture, the culture of resistance that is being born. And then, of course, I think most of us who, reading even from I think it has always been quotations from Malcolm X, for instance, the distinction between the field Negro. We thought that this radicalism is born in the plantation, but Robbie is telling us there was an hinterland where slaves had these two great initiatives where they produced collectively, but also imagined the future beyond slavery, and therefore they develop a new culture of resistance, but also of redistribution. I think these were great points. We have always thought that abolition was a great step. We didn't think that it was emancipatory politically, but it was dispossessive or regressive in other ways, and especially in destroying the communal lens and production. And I think this is great. And if you can give us a reference, we will be glad to learn that as part of documenting and learning this entire history and experience of Africans. Asante sana, Robbie. This was very eye-opening to me. Thank you.
Good, thanks. Yeah, that's really really great. And I'm riffing off something that you said as well. That I think that when we think about neoliberalism, we tend to think we sometimes tend to think about it as a individualizing thing, right? And that is not what it is, right? I mean, it is in some ways, but in terms of how neoliberals think of social cohesion, it's not, right? So one thing that I noticed, I'm not an expert, but I noticed when I started watching Nollywood films, there was always something about an extended family. The town was always linked to the rural area somehow, right? And now all the Nollywood things I ever see are just these nuclear families. There's one kid, there's the husband and the wife is doing something bad and blah, 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 right? And that speaks to this, to what neoliberal policies do, even when they're doing it about land, right? Because it's about so yeah, Margaret Thatcher, famous prime minister in Britain, who with Ronald Reagan is a big cheerleader of neoliberalism. She's always quoted out of context. So she has this speech where she says, there is no such thing as society, right? And people usually quote this bit, right? There's hold on. I think this is what she says. I think we've gone through a period where too many children and people have been given to understand, I have a problem, it's the government's job to cope with it. I have a problem, I'll go and get a grant to cope with it. I'm homeless, the government must house me. And so they are casting their problems on society. And who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women. Now, most people stop there, but that's not what she says. This is what she says. There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. So what she's talking about, right, is that the economic unit of neoliberalism and the thing through which all social cohesion is supposed to maintain, even in the conditions of land dispossession and everything, is this nuclear family, right? That's what's supposed to give the social order its integrity. But that nuclear family is only it can aspire towards independence, right? Meaning of independent means. And that's where we get all this stuff about resilience in development literature, right? But it can never aspire to self-determination, to collective self-determination. And that's the stuff that you're talking about, Sabatho. And that's the bit which abolition, and ever since abolition, has been trying to stamp out. And I think that's where we need to think about it.
Asante sana, Robbie and Sabatho, for making connections. It's really important for us. I mean, it seems for all of us, but also at HUMA, to make sure that all African experiences are brought to the fore. And sometimes we don't do enough, if I can say for Kenya, to make sure we include the diaspora in our conversations. So hopefully these are just incremental steps to make sure we recognize Africa's in all of the different ways Africa is. And so we have, thank you again for making these meaningful connections, and hopefully we are at question and answer period now. And so we'll open the floor for questions. I see Carmelisa has one, but perhaps if, Carmelisa, if you don't mind putting on your video and asking your question, maybe you can introduce yourself. And then we can also make time for other questions. We'll have a few rounds. So thank you again to Robbie and Sabatho, and maybe Carmelisa, you can ask the question.
Yeah, hi, thank you for the floor. My name is Carmelisa Rosario. I'm a researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Norway. I'm originally from Mozambique, a social anthropologist. And my question is to Robbie. Thank you for the very rich discussion, both of you, Sabatho and Robbie. And as Sabatho said, it's very illuminating. And my question is to Robbie. I was wondering about these hinterlands that you speak of, which I understood it to be from actual slaves, so not liberated and not escaped slaves. But there were, for example, in Brazil and all over Latin America, quilombos, which were spaces created by escaped slaves, where there was also this imagination of life outside slavery and a lot of collectiveness and resistance. So I was wondering if these hinterlands and these quilombos have any, are equivalent, or is there any difference between the two? Yeah, that's my question.
Ooh, thank you, Robbie. Maybe we can get a few more before we go. I don't know if anyone has their hand up. If not, I have lots, but I don't want to be the dictator because I already ambushed you both. I'm very glad I ambushed you both. Okay, maybe I can ask a few questions. Thank you, Carmelisa, for yours. So my first one is to Sabatho. Sabatho, as you know, and as you mentioned, Kenya is just, I think we are like the capitalist node of East Africa, unfortunately. And I feel increasingly that the land question is being buried here. And so when recently in 2016, the British said, okay, we've made a monument for the Mau Mau and now you can't ask for anything. And why I'm bringing this up is because I feel in those processes, in making monuments, in court cases, although are important, increasingly because they seem to be dealing with the Mau Mau, then the land question is buried. So my question to you, Sabatho, is what your comments on this, but also whether you feel that decoloniality, real decoloniality, is premised on land and land distribution. And my question to Robbie is, you've gestured towards this, and so did Carmelisa. If we think of communities like in Akompong in Jamaica, in Palmares in Brazil, in Palenque in Colombia, all over the diaspora, when Africans were resisting enslavement, they sought land to recreate in some ways new societies that would foster these cultures that were allowed them to live, these African cultures that allowed them to live. But land was central to that. So I was wondering if you could talk about that, but if you could also talk about the importance of land for Rastafarians in Ethiopia, because that's also a critical question. They wanted land in Ethiopia. I don't know if you could tie that in. And also my last question, you see, I'm being a really bad dictator, but I just have to ask this question. You talked a bit about how the British, as part of this fear of the changing society, they were fearful, and you see this in lots of anthropology literature in I'm sure across Africa, but this fear of the detribalized native. And for them, core to that someone being detribalized is because they were displaced from the rural area and they were in the city. They were just wanton rogues. That was the imaginary, that Africans, once they were removed from rural areas, they just become like basically Uhuru Kenyatta's dad or Jomo Kenyatta. They would just be these people in the city becoming urban, and that's not what Africans should have been. But in highlighting that, what I wanted to highlight, and Sabatho was talking about this a lot, was that core to this reproduction of a rural society was the mother, but keeping the African woman in place in rural areas. And so I don't know if you can speak a little bit about that. I don't know if that's a question, but I wanted to highlight that because you were talking about how the British had this moral panic of the changing native. And for us, it's often posed as the detribalized native. And key to that detribalization is displacement from land. So in one sense, they're like, we don't care, you can take all of your land. We love settler colonialism. But there was also this real fear of the native changing. And in that fear of the native changing is a recognition that land was key to the core and the humanity of the African. So thank you. I'll stop the questions now, and perhaps you can answer that round, and hopefully other people can raise questions. So go ahead. Maybe Robbie can start now.
Oh, thank you. So I think there's I'm trying to think about how we can tie it all in. So I think that, okay, so there are the Quilombos, the Maroon communities, but there are attempts to collectively self-determine on land all over the place. It's a whole spectrum. So if you go onto the plantation, the huts where the enslaved people are, they have gardens and they grow stuff in the gardens, right? Then they have the provision grounds at the back, and they're out of sight. You know, they go there at night. They're out of sight, right? So the way that I would say we want to think about this is that if one of the founding conditions of Africans in the diaspora, and I would even also put this east as well to the Indian Ocean, right? If one of the founding conditions is landlessness, right? Then what we have to see is that the African diaspora are finding ways to self-determine and cultivate land everywhere and anywhere they are. So it's a whole spectrum, right? Do you get what I'm saying? It's a whole spectrum. 1 kilometer away from the master's house, 100 kilometers away from the master's house. It's the same thing. Now, they have various kinds of quasi-legal, illicit, illegal, incendiary, seditious kind of legal standings. But for the people who are doing it, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. How do we collectively self-determine in conditions where it's not just that we've been made commodities, but that we've been made landless, right? Now, that is important because then the distinction between the rural and urban, it's not that there aren't differences, obviously, but the anthropological distinction starts to break down, because what do Black people do in urban areas? They find every place, right, to self-determine, right? Whether that be growing crops on marginal land, maize at the side of the road or whatever, right? Whether it be to get community centers, right? Whether it is to occupy vacant housing and squat in order to do that. And to link that to, and the point as well is that if one of the determining features of the diasporic experience is this struggle over land, right? And that struggle doesn't go one way. You know, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up. In other words, the legal standing of these claims on land are always being overturned and disputed and remade and overturned and disputed, right? So what we find is that people go from legal to quasi-illegal very quickly, but they still try and self-determine. So for example, the Shashamane land, right, given by Haile Selassie as a land grant, right? Now this is a formal piece of land, right? Then obviously with the Derg, then all the land becomes nationalized. And now with the development over the last 10 or 15 years, Shashamane is a massive growth point, you know, and the town has buttressed right up onto the original land grant, what they call the Jamaican Sefa, right? And now there are disputes over that. So now that land has become basically a provision ground again, right? You see what I'm saying, right? So, so I think that's the way that we want to think about it. And the gender element in this is really important, because this whole idea of the changing native is fundamental, and it's one of the most under-examined ways in which the whole apartheid structure in Southern Africa delivered us fundamental frameworks of development. Because all the peeps who are talking about changing native, they're always talking about Southern Africa. They're always talking about the extractive industries, all of that. And that's what they're worried about. Now get this, the same social anthropologists who do their fieldwork in Southern Africa, do it in Kenya, do it in Sierra Leone, are the same ones who then go back to the metropoles and do analyses of Black and non-white communities in the urban areas. So the same ones who talk about the changing native in colonial development are the same ones using the same framework, talking about race relations in urban centers. Exactly the same thing. Now, like Wangui said, then you've got this image of the mother in the rural areas supposed to just hold down everything, and then the grandmother's got to hold down even what the mother can't hold down, right? And that anything which the woman does, which is not that particular conservative task, right, is seen as irrespectable, insurrectionary. Well, this is why Black women in the urban centers, right, who are holding down the fort with jobs, are the ones who are demonized in neoliberal policy as welfare mothers, welfare queens, the ones who breed more than they can actually feed. Do you get what I mean? And if you look to the Clintons, when they're doing all their whole neoliberal thing, it's the welfare queen, which is the character which says that these people are not worthy of welfare or social security. So we have to shut all that down on behalf of neoliberalism. So what I'm trying to tease out is these actually connected situations and these connected paths between the rural and the urban, the continent and the diaspora.
Asante, Robbie. Sabatho?
Thank you. On the land question, I think I agree. I mean, colonialism was it was a total project of dispossession on every aspect of life, but including but not limited to land and labor. And land which was dispossessed in one way or another. Even in countries, I mean, in settler colonies, we know, like Kenya or South Africa or Zimbabwe and other places, there was massive dispossession. But even in countries like places like the present-day mainland Tanzania, where after bitter struggles to regain the land, especially the Maji-Maji War, they had to rethink the type of agriculture they are going to practice, and therefore they started promoting peasant agriculture. Even in these countries, the ultimate ownership of land was put in the British Crown, and therefore the natives did not have any land rights, and these land rights they were only merely so-called customary occupants of land, and their rights would be extinguished anytime at the pleasure of the governor as a representative of the British Crown. And therefore, I think decolonization cannot be complete without repossessing the land. Because to me, it presents, it is a historical injustice, and one way of correcting these injustices is first to regain the land. And we can see there has been resistance, for instance, for many of these countries. Actually, the West, former colonizers, can tolerate when you take a conservative approach to the land question, which I think was taken in Kenya, where part of the land was repossessed but not redistributed. It was given to the new black elite, the Kenyatta family, being one of the largest landholders in Kenya. They can tolerate that, but they cannot tolerate a radical repossession of the land, for instance, without compensation. And that's what happened, for instance, in Zimbabwe. We know, for instance, that after the Lancaster Agreement, which led to the, so-called independence, the political independence of Zimbabwe in the 80s, and after that, Mugabe was the darling of the West until the late 1990s, when he was forced. Actually, ZAN was forced by the war veterans and other rural movements to pursue what they call the fast track land reform, the repossession of the land without compensation. And we know there was a lot of resistance from the West. For instance, the British at that time, and the Prime Minister was Tony Blair, and I think it was Thabo Mbeki. Thabo Mbeki was president of South Africa at the time, and he later revealed that actually Blair had approached South Africa on the possibility of invading Zimbabwe in order to topple down the Mugabe regime. And of course, South Africa did not agree to that plan. And what followed was then another war, an economic war on Zimbabwe. Despite so many, I don't necessarily want to justify the heavy-handedness of the Zimbabwean state, but that's another thing. On the other hand, the West could not even give the Zimbabwean state the right to take control of the land that had been dispossessed by the colonial regime from the people. So that is one aspect why we should take the land. But the other aspect is that the future of work in our countries. I mean, in the West, I think this model of having few landowners, I've been trying to understand how it works. I mean, how do you dispossess the majority of the people, and then how do they survive? So if we look at the Western model, I think there were factories which absorbed part of this population, but not all of it. We know for so many years, the West was exporting its population. So it had the policy of a population export. Hundreds and millions of people were taken to the New World and later to the new colonies, first in the Americas and then later to other colonies in Africa. What about us? I think we don't have, of course, a lot of our young people have been trying to flee the continent to Europe and America, and we know what happens to them. We don't have America to take our so-called unemployed, what they call surplus population, our unemployed youth. We don't have America or Africa to take them there. They have to remain here and be productive on their own land. And for that to happen, if you look at the statistics in Tanzania, every year there are new entrants, 1 million new entrants in the labor market. Only those who get employed in the formal sector are only 40,000. So 960,000 people do not have formal employment. The only employment they have, the only options is agriculture in rural areas or informal street trading in urban areas. And both avenues, for instance, currently are being closed away from them. There's a lot of dispossession in rural areas. There's a lot of eviction from public, from the commons in urban areas. So the real question, I think, is pertinent, not only in Kenya, where this historical injustice has not been corrected, but also in our countries where it has been corrected. But the same corporations are coming back in a different way to make sure that they repossess the land and dispossess the land and take back in the hand of the few. Asante.
Asante sana, Sabatho. We have a question from Divine, which I can read unless Divine wants to ask it. Okay, should I? I know my South African people are having issues with power, so they're in and out. So maybe I'll ask Divine's question, but if anyone else has a question, feel free to raise your hand. So Divine is asking, how valuable is land in an economy that is now about abstract numbers? And if I can tag something onto that, in Kenya, there's always this fake narrative that if a poor person in Lamu or somewhere sells land, it's about willing power, willing buyer, willing seller. I don't know if you have that narrative. And the power dynamics implicit in that exchange are not interrogated at all. So perhaps I can tag that on to Divine's question. Anyone else have a question? I know, Pole, I know our South African people are in and out, and we had someone from African Studies who works on land, but I think their electricity is in and out. So maybe we can, I'm not sure who wants to respond to this question, Robbie or maybe you can both intervene. Yeah.
Let me ask Sabatho. The only thing that I would add, put as a preface is that during the pandemic, the stock market roared. So there is a massive difference. In other words, the stock market is not the economy, right? In terms of if we think about economy as a system by which people collectively source their needs, the stock market is not the economy. But that's all I can say. Sabatho, I know you're going to be much more intelligent than me now.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Sabatho.
Thank you. I think I answered part of that question in my as I was trying to explain the previous point, but maybe I should add a few points, especially on the willing buyer and willing seller narrative. Of course, that is a market arrangement, and that can only work among elites. The new empowered so-called black elite who have money. They have money, and therefore they can use that money. They are well connected to the state. They can use that money to buy part of the property and be part of the owners of property. But that is not emancipatory, because it's only a few. And that model I think it's a model that has worked, has been used in Kenya, and partly in South Africa. And that's why you have some fewer rich black people, including the South African president. But the majority of South Africans, actually the majority of South Africans are very poor. The poor in South Africa is poorer than a poor person in a country, say like Tanzania, and I think the same applies in Kenya, where you have a lot of people who cannot even produce their own food. So I think there has to be repossession of the land without compensation, because those who stole the land did not buy it, even until now, and how much an acre of land costs. If a multinational comes to Africa, I had written it somewhere. Let me check if I still have it. Voila. So they buy 1 hectare of land for 2.5 cents. 1 hectare of land in Africa. And as I speak to you now, 123 million acres of land, 123 million acres of land, which is double the size of England, has been grabbed between 2008 to the present, you know. So, and why, and this I'm connecting to the last explanation that Robbie was trying to make. There is, I mean, stock exchange is not an economy. Even economists themselves make a distinction between what they call the real economy and the fictitious economy, you know. And after the crash, I mean, 2008 changed everything. There was a crash of the stock market. This financialized economy. And in the West, if you read the literature, and I mean, their reports are very clear. In 2009, for instance, the World Bank issued a report titled, and this is, I mean, a few months after the crisis, the report was titled, Awakening Africa's Sleeping Agricultural Giant. And in that report, it was actually appealing to Western multinationals, telling them that there's a lot of land in Africa, and this land is free. It is not occupied. Yeah? The same terra nullius narrative about African land, which the colonialists used. And now in 2009, the World Bank is saying that. So it's inviting multinationals to come to Africa, to take their land and engage in agricultural production, because that's where the future lies, you know. And as I've cited the statistics, 123 million hectares of land have been grabbed, mostly from smallholder producers in Africa and taken into the hands of multinationals. So the capitalists and imperialists know the value of land from their historical association with land and production. So our people, I think the majority of our people also, of course, know, but of course, in countries where the people have been dispossessed for long, I mean, they have been born in families with no land, probably they can be threatened, because I've heard about that narrative in South Africa and even in other countries where, you know, if someone tries to tamper with the land, they're like, oh, what are you going to do with the land? Look at Zimbabwe. People were given land and they could not even produce, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think the future of Africa lies in the land. We can't have the majority of our people who are roaming in the streets in urban areas, unemployed. They can't even produce plantain. I mean, to plant a banana, you don't need everything. You just put a banana plant there and then it just grows. You need to water it. In some cases, you don't even need to water it. The land is fertile, and there's enough water for the banana plant to grow. But that cannot happen if there is no land. So it's important. The first and foremost value is to feed the African people. The majority of our people, as we speak, there are lots of people who go to bed. Actually, they don't have beds, actually. They don't even have places to, but they spend the entire night without food. They are starving. Yeah. So the first and foremost value of this land is to be able to feed our people. I was in China. I stayed for 3 months in 2019. And a professor was giving a presentation actually advocating why China should open up its land. You know, the rural land, the agricultural land in China is very protected against grabbing. But he was just advocating, you know, urbanization should continue to expand and we shouldn't worry about the Chinese population. And he's pointing to, and I asked him a question, where are you going to produce your food? Saying, you know, there's a lot of land in Africa. He's pointing to Ethiopia and even said Tanzania. I was like, wait. I said, Professor, I'm from Tanzania. There is no land there, okay? My people are killing one another. You know, peasants and pastoralists are killing one another. You know, deadly violent conflicts, fighting for scarce land. Why? Because the majority, the huge tracts of land have been granted to multinational companies. So land is very important. The capitalists and the imperialists know that. That's why they are leading in the new scramble of African land. And the African people, I think they should be in the front of this resistance and to make sure that land is redistributed equally and is used productively for the development and future of Africa. Asante.
Thank you, Sabatho. We'll take the last round of questions. So we'll have, sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, but Zetwal Ima. Thank you. And then Nicholas, I hope you don't mind if you ask a question after Zetwal, and then anyone else, and then we can close. So please go ahead, Zetwal.
Hi, good afternoon. It's afternoon for me, maybe good evening to others. I'm really grateful for this conversation. I missed some of it, but I'm really grateful for what I have caught and what I've heard today. I'm a scholar of African gender and sexuality studies with my family. My people are from Haiti, from Haiti. And my question is about Haiti, actually. Both of the speakers, Sabatho and Robbie, both spoke about Haiti, both in a kind of exceptional way, right? One of the things that Robbie mentioned was that, only in Haiti was the land redistributed after enslaved peoples liberated themselves in Haiti. So I'm wondering, to fast forward, and Sabatho, you talked about teaching the Haitian Revolution in the context, I think, of a decolonial histories class. I'm wondering if you have any commentary to link this conversation about land dispossession and sort of land crisis as it might come to bear upon the contemporary struggles and crises that are happening in Haiti at this time. I think people have talked about sort of the pressures of urbanization, cities such as Port-au-Prince, which are kind of bursting at the seams, the lack of housing because of, the double earthquakes that have happened in the last several years. And also people have talked a little bit about, but I don't think enough, about the impact of the neoliberal policies of the Clinton regime and others, and how they've impacted land and agricultural production in Haiti. So I was wondering if you could perhaps speak on Haiti specifically in a more contemporary context. But thank you very much.
Thank you also, Zetwal. Nicholas, I don't know if you're okay to turn on your video to ask a question.
Yes, thank you, Wangoi. My name is Nicholas Mwangi from Kenya. And my question was in regard, yes, massive land dispossession and land grabbing has been an issue historically in Africa. But I would like to hear what is happening today in regard to indigenous communities in Africa and any other part of the world, like the Okiek in Kenya and Tanzania, also the Maasai in Kenya and Tanzania. I think Sabatho had mentioned something about multinational corporations being invited to Africa to invest, as he was quoting the World Bank report. So I think somehow he answered, but I'd like maybe if we can explore further what is happening around the world in regard to so-called indigenous, I don't know, maybe the indigenous community term could be problematic, I don't know, but that's how I refer to them. Yeah,
Asante, Nicholas. And if I can steal one question as well. So, when this is not a long-winded question, I promise, it's just a preface, but when you are organizing HUMA-ASAA seminars, you just email people and then you pray to all your ancestors. You say, please let Robbie accept this invitation. Please let Sabatho accept this invitation. And you did. And I'm very grateful for that. But why this is a preface is because I wanted to ask now, not obviously, hopefully we're working towards this, but beyond these conversations, what kind of collective land or collective geographies can we imagine for Africa and the diaspora? Robbie has talked a little bit about now Shashamane and the Rastafari community being kind of now in the hinterland, but we also think about, I think there was the effort, the AU is problematic, but I think they extended invitation to Haiti to be part of the African Union. And I think when there was the earthquake, if I'm not mistaken, Senegal said Haitians could live there. But is this possible? Can we imagine a collective geography or a collective way to bring a collective territory? Because right now we just have an imagined, I feel sometimes an imagined territory, but how do we ground this in land, the land that we're all talking about? What's possible for both the diaspora and continental Africans like us here to imagine? Is there a possible collective geography that we can imagine? So perhaps Robbie and Sabatho, you can, in response, maybe offer your closing remarks. Thank you. I'm not sure, perhaps Robbie, you want to start?
Oh, I don't know if I have too much to say, to be honest. Those are great questions and provocations, and they really open things up. I mean, I guess all I would say is that if we want to do the project you're scoping out, Wangui, then we really need to start with the categories that we use, and like I was intonating, there's difference, but difference doesn't mean not connectedness. And the categories that we have inherited, especially from social anthropology, are categories of segregation, and the categories that segregate in order to order. Right? So I think if I had one humble prefatory thing to say, it would be that. Interestingly, linguists are doing something like that. There's a linguist I know in Puerto Rico who's Nicholas Farraklas, who is tracing the spread and development of African Creoles around the world to scope out a theory of self-determination, collective self-determination. And so I think there are places we can look at which we don't necessarily always look at to help us to think differently to them categories which we usually in the social sciences at least kind of start with, right? I think the other thing to say is that I would love Zetoile to tell us a bit more. I mean, I'm aware of the, I mean, really, to my mind, ever since the American occupation, before that, even with the French, but certainly since the American occupation, the signal attack on Haiti has been in many ways to actually unwind that precarious land self-determination, right? In wave after wave, especially with the Clintons, even with the evangelicals, man. But so I would really love to hear more about that, because I think it is part of that big sweep that we were talking about these gains being reversed, being fought for. If you get what I mean, even places which seem to be secure are not secure. And I think that's a general phenomenon of the African diaspora, but also connected to the continent.
Asante sana, Robbie. Sabatho?
Asante. I think I should plead my ignorance on the contemporary aspects of Haiti. I think in most cases, for most of us, we only read about the historical Haiti up to 1804, and that's it. So even today is my birthday. So a friend brought me a book, and they brought it to me. But it's about the Black Spartacus, the epic life of Toussaint Louverture. So in most cases, it ends there. But I take it as a challenge. Of course, I have read here and there articles about Haiti, and I think in the 2 past weeks, I think Horace Kembo wrote an article to understand about the assassination of the Haitian president, the dynamics leading to that, what happened after the revolution to the present. So, but I really wished Zetwal could share more about the contemporary aspects and linking it with what is going on in the conversation. But I just hope we'll continue to interact and exchange after this conversation, and would be really glad to have references and continue this conversation in order to understand and read about what is happening in the present. Nicholas and the indigenous communities, of course, the term itself is debatable, but anyway, let's use it as it is. They are really facing a lot of threats. One is their model of existence. If you look at the Maasai, for instance, in Tanzania, I mean, the president of the current president, who is a darling of the West, basically, she has already declared war on the Maasai, and especially the Maasai of Ngorongoro. She's saying why should they continue to stay in Ngorongoro and they can't be taken elsewhere? So she really wants to drive them out of the Ngorongoro conservation areas, because for her, like the colonial imaginary about conservation has to do with animals and trees, but not human beings. But historically, if you look at the history, I went to Ngorongoro some months ago when initially, actually, the government had released a list of individuals, the sons and daughters of Ngorongoro, who were deemed surplus population. So they were supposed to, as a first step, to be evicted from the conservation area, and then later others would follow. The conservation Ngorongoro is supposed to be empty. So we went there, visited and talked to the Maasai pastoralists in Ngorongoro, and it was amazing because even when we were traveling to Ngorongoro, we could see the Maasai women working freely, the Maasai young people heading the cattle, and alongside there's a giraffe, So for them, and even when we were talking to them, they were telling us that Ngorongoro is what it is today, not because the state conserved it, but it's because the Maasai conserved it until today. So they could coexist with animals. And what was interesting that traditionally the Maasai had given animals clans. So you can't, I think a lion is I don't know, belongs to the Laser clan. So you can't kill an animal, for game, because the animal is your relative, the lion is your relative, the elephant is your relative, etc. As opposed to the Western conception where the lion and they have to be conserved, but they also, this contradiction. On the one hand, they talk about conservation. On the other hand, most of the companies about game hunting are owned by Westerners. So they come to kill the animals, but also they come to champion conservation. So their image of conservation does not include people, and the Maasai's image of conservation is coexistence between, and this dependence between humans and nature. They are interconnected and they cannot be separated. So they are saying they can't go away and they are going to fight. Because among other things, most of the residents of Ngorongoro were actually living in Serengeti. So when the colonial regime was declaring Serengeti to be a national park, they asked them to move to this present area, which is Ngorongoro today. And when they lived there, they conserved it until it was declared one of the world wonders. And now they want to be evicted even from there. So there's a real struggle about these indigenous people. Prior to this, the current president, the fourth phase president in Tanzania, for instance, Jakaya Kikwete, was actually fighting. They are not only fighting for the presence of the Maasai in the so-called conserved areas, but also they are fighting against their model of pastoralism. They're saying it's outdated, it's destroying the environment and all that. But the Maasai lifestyle is different, and I hope we can have this conversation. It really deserves another session where we can probably invite, if possible, the pastoralists from the Maasai. We should be able. There are those who can speak English, but we should be able even to have a translation facility. And I know there are some in Kenya, in order to have this conversation about the future of indigenous communities, including the Maasai and the land question and the current drive to dispossess them. My last words, I thank you, Wangoi, asante sana, for you personally and HUMA in particular. This is a great conversation, kwa kweli. As I said, I mean, globally, there are intellectual hierarchies, and we have been having this conversation, not even conversations, they are just presentations. You're being given 5 minutes to present about Africa, and no one really engages you critically as an intellectual looking for your views, but basically they just want looking for details here and there, because in most cases Africans are not deemed to be intellectuals, even of their own contexts and environments. So I really liked the interactive nature of this conversation, and I hope we keep it going, and we should have more of these. Asante sana. Thank you so much.
Asante, tunashukuru. Sabatho, thank you so much. Robbie, thank you to all who could make it. And for those whose electricity had an issue, I know many of our HUMA people in South Africa are dealing with that. This will be available online. Just again to advertise that the ASA conference is next year. We hope to continue these conversations there. The review of abstracts, the conclusion will be announced next week. If I'm not, it will be concluded next week. So you should receive information if you sent in an abstract. Registration will open next week. Pre-conference workshops will be advertised soon. And also scholarships will be advertised, because we want everyone to make it to the conference. But until then, there'll be more HUMA-ASAA seminars. The next one in November is on race, gender, and race and gender struggles in Africa and the diaspora. So thank you once again to Nashkuru, to Robbie, and we thank you to all our participants for making the time, and keep well.
Asante sana, thank you.